come down on the floor so I can actually watch the slides as I describe you, take you on my little journey through the Middle East. Thank you, that was very nice, Phil. I want to add to the story about my unanimous confirmation. I truly was unanimously confirmed to the position of district judge, but there's a little bit more to the story. The day I was being voted on by the Senate, a colleague, Andy Guilford, who's now a judge in Los Angeles, was also being voted on. The tradition is for the first judge you have a roll call vote, and Andy went through this wonderful roll call vote. It was confirmed 99-0. That roll call vote took about 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I'm watching on C-SPAN. The next thing I hear is my name is called to be voted on by the U.S. Senate to be the United States District Judge. And of course, my heart was beating very, very fast. And instead of having a roll call vote, it was a voice vote. So I was expecting a loud, thunderous, all aye. It was one vote. Aye. And I panicked. I absolutely panicked. I said, oh my God, Andy got confirmed 99-0. I'm going to be defeated 1-99. The next thing I heard was that the acting president of the Senate called for all no's. It was dead silence in the courtroom. Excuse me, in the floor of the Senate. And I realized I had just been confirmed 1-0. The tradition is the second judge is voted on the voice vote, so the senators can be rushing to the, it's always on a Thursday afternoon, rushing to the airport to go home. And so they do the roll call vote, the first judge, and then one senator stays back. The senator that voted for me was what I never would have thought would vote for me in the first place, was Dick Durbin. So that's the rest of the story. Now, 2 years ago today, on May 28th, or 28th May in military terms, I reported to Fort Benning, Georgia for this 7 months of mobilization. As Phil said, this was towards the end of my career in the military. I wasn't looking for another rank because I knew at 06, a colonel in the reserves in the JAG Corps, it's about as high as you would get. There were only like 3 general slots in the reserves. I was doing this because I was asked to do it by my country, and of course, when you're asked, you really want to serve. The slide you see now, it says Middle East, but the military refers to it as Southwest Asia because that's exactly what it is. Next slide. So I reported to Fort Benning, these are my first quarters. I was told, Colonel, we have great accommodations for you. Next slide. These are my accommodations. What was great about my accommodations is I got the room to myself. Every lieutenant colonels and below were sharing 2, 3, 4 total room. But I've toured, as a federal judge, I've toured many federal prisons. I promise you, I was living no better than inmates. Next slide. On 3 June, I was ordered, we had gone through a week of intense training, including one day where I had 6 shots, which I'll never forget. And I didn't faint, although there was a time I thought about it. We reported to the Green Ramp before Benning for an Army charter. Omni Air was the name of the airlines, but the U.S. Army had chartered the whole aircraft. About 200 of us got on board, and we deployed, next slide, from Fort Benning to Kuwait, and particularly for me, to Camp Arifjan, Kuwait, which is in southern Kuwait. Other soldiers went forward to Iraq, Afghanistan, wherever they were supposed to go. My base was in Kuwait. Next slide, please. This is a map of Kuwait. You can see down in the green to the lower right is Camp Arifjan. It's in southern Kuwait. 20 miles north of there is Kuwait City, and about 20 miles west of Kuwait City is Ali Al-Salam Airfield, which is also on there. And from Ali Al-Salam Airfield, that's the gateway to theater. And so out of Ali Al-Salam Airfield, I flew up to Iraq or Afghanistan. Next slide. Because my mission was to preside over all court martials in theater. That included some in Kuwait, actually. These are my first quarters in Kuwait. You see it's modular housing. The 4 buildings that are to the front there are actually latrines and showers. My quarters are down to the right. Next slide. These are my lovely quarters. The reason I enjoyed these quarters is, once again, as a colonel, I've got a private room. But 05s and below, or lieutenant colonels and below, shared these quarters. So you can see how cramped it was for others. I consider this actually ideal what they were living in. Next slide, please. After a couple months there, I became the only judge in theater. There's always an overlap between judges, kind of the judges being trained by the judge that's already there. I get to move into these hardened barracks, in Kuwait, which I enjoyed. They were a lot more accommodating. They also had indoor plumbing, which was always something we liked after we lived through the 20th century and then the 21st. Next slide, please. This was the headquarters at Camp Arifjan. Next slide. This is the courtroom in Camp Arifjan. Occasionally, I'd have a court martial in Kuwait, but most of my court martials were in Iraq and Afghanistan. The ones in Kuwait were for soldiers that were up on the border. And, there were 3 major installations up on the border: Camp Virginia, Camp New York, and Camp Uring. And one example of a court martial I had here was a soldier that was at Camp Uring who was in a guard tower with locked and loaded M60 machine gun, looking down on the entrance into Camp Uring, and he was smoking spice, which is artificial or synthetic marijuana, and he was pretty high for the whole 8 hours he was up there. That's the type of court martials I've had in Kuwait. Next slide, please. By the way, I gave him 10 months. I thought if it had been the Civil War, he probably would have been executed. Literally. There are 3 things, in my opinion, in Kuwait. There's sand. Another picture. Next slide. More sand. Right. Next slide. There's oil. These are all oil wells. Next slide. And they're camels. And they're camels. If you're in a helicopter, which I was quite a bit, flying around Kuwait, you see camels everywhere. And the camels now are bred to be racers. I mean, it's like Kentucky. They're bred and very valuable. Next slide, please. Kuwait City is as modern as any city as you'll ever see in the United States. It's an amazing city. It illustrates the wealth of Kuwait. Next slide. This is their Washington Monument. This is the Kuwait water towers. When Saddam invaded in 1990, he went to those immediately because it was kind of symbolic to capture those. And his troops just destroyed the towers and they were rebuilt. They weren't destroyed in the sense of collapse, but they did such damage to the interior that it took a long time to rebuild or to renovate it. Next slide, please. So, I just went through Kuwait, and I kind of flashed through it because I spent most of my time in Iraq and Afghanistan. But that was my base station. I'd go back to Kuwait, usually just to do my laundry, quite honestly, and like I said, the occasional court martial. From Kuwait, which if you look on, you can't see from a distance here, but Kuwait's such a small country, but it's right there at the, thank you, to the south east corner of Iraq, and it's about the size of New Jersey, while Iraq is basically about the size of, a little bit smaller than Texas. I'll give you an idea, or it's a little bit smaller than that, but it's a huge country. But I'd fly up to southern Iraq or northern Iraq, depending upon where I'm going in Iraq, how I travel. I fly by rotary wing up to southern Iraq. Just beyond that, I fly a fixed wing. And when I was going to Afghanistan, we had an obstacle to get to Afghanistan. It's called Iran. And the trip, when I was going to Afghanistan, I could be traveling for the whole day because we'd have to fly all the way down the Persian Gulf to the UAE, United Arab Emirates. Down there, we'd refuel, and then we'd circle out over the Indian Ocean, and then we'd go up right along the Iranian-Pakistani border until we got in Afghanistan. And frequently, the Iranians would try to lull us into their airspace. They would send false radio communications. And sometimes I sat up front and the pilots didn't know what was going on. Next slide, please. So I go to Ali Al-Salam Airfield, which was west of Kuwait City, excuse me. This was the main airfield for both the U.S. Air Force and the Kuwaiti Air Force. Next slide. This is looking at the airfield because we couldn't take pictures on the tarmac, so this is a couple miles back from the airfield. If you look to the left, you can see tails of C-17s and C-130s. Next slide. Now, because when I was flying to a mission, to a court-martial or to a rule of law meeting or something like that, I had priority flight authorization. I actually had a letter from General David Petraeus back before a certain incident made it. At the time, I never knew he had a Charlotte connection. But with that letter from General Petraeus, I could actually get, and I'm glad the government's gone, I could get one of these aircraft. This is a UC-35, and only in the Army and the Air Force where the UC stands for utility cargo for a Cessna citation. The reason I say I'm glad the governor's gone, next slide please. These aircraft are actually supplied by the Army and Air National Guards of the various states. These Cessna citations are governor's planes. And so I felt pretty good. I'm flying the governor's plane. So when Governor McCrory is rushing back to Raleigh, that's the seat he's flying in. And I do think the National Guard here has assessed a citation, but these are primarily government planes that are mobilized and used by generals and fat old colonels like me. Next slide. Most of the time, I didn't get such luxury in a utility cargo aircraft. Instead, I get in a classical C-130. Next slide. This is the troop seats in the C-130. You can do a comparison of what governors fly in versus what soldiers fly in. Classic troop seats there, and the soldiers, you can see them as asleep, because a soldier just sleeps whenever you get a chance, because and the combat zone is 24/7. There's no holidays. I had a court martial on July 4th. I really felt for that soldier. that he still did something wrong, and we proceeded with the court martial nonetheless. Next slide. Now, when I was flying in southern Iraq, or I was flying to back and forth to Afghanistan, if you're going to southern Iraq, I fly in a Black Hawk. That's these helicopter rotary wing aircraft right in front of the C-17. The Black Hawks are amazing helicopters. They're very smooth. They're very maneuverable. And then the C-17 behind that is an amazing piece of equipment. We have a wing of them down at Charleston Air Force Base, and probably if you're down in Charleston, you might see some flying over. They're enormous. They have the capacity of carrying a tank. I actually was in one when it was carrying 2 MRAPs, and I'll show you the MRAP in a minute. Next slide. That gives you, that's a C-17 from the air at Ali al-Salam, just as brought in land, so you can see how enormous it is. Next slide. Every now and then, because I was a senior officer on the aircraft usually, I could go up and sit in the jump seat. So I was up in the cockpit here. Next slide. And that's a picture of me proving I was in the cockpit. One time we flew over the Persian Gulf at night, because the C-17s like to fly at night, so they're not visible. And we looked down, you could actually see Dubai, you could see the Palm Island. It was pretty amazing what you could see from the Persian Gulf. Next slide. This is the cockpit of a Black Hawk, and I did fly in Black Hawks all the time. They were my best means of travel around Iraq, because you didn't go outside the wire unless you went in a Black Hawk or an armored vehicle. So this is looking at the cockpit of the Black Hawk. Next slide. Now, guns down was always a good thing. When these M60 machine guns were pointing down, that means you were in friendly territory. Next slide. But when the gun's up, that means you're in hostile territory. Here we're flying, we're in northern Iraq flying over the Mosul, and it was considered. We didn't receive any incoming rounds or anything, but we were always prepared. One time I was sitting in the door of a Black Hawk, and we crossed into a hostile area, and I saw 2 flares shoot off. And I immediately panicked, because when a flare shoots off, that means the flares detected some heat and thinks it's an incoming heat-seeking missile. And luckily, it turned out we weren't under fire. The Black Hawk, the sensors to the flares detected some reflection. And particularly when it's really hot, 110, 120 degrees in Iraq, there's a lot more reflections than you normally have. But I was sitting in the door, and the door was wide open, and we kind of leaned, literally, I just leaned forward a little bit, and it's 1,200 feet straight down. I was a paratrooper, but even then I'd get a little nervous when the door was open. Next slide. This is just a photograph of what you see all over Iraq, an oil well, and you see the guns up, so it's a hostile area. Next slide. That's a picture taken of me by a major that you'll see a picture of in a few minutes. We just were getting ready to go from Al-Fal Palace, which is in western Baghdad, into the green zone. We had to gear up because it was a pretty hot area between the two. Next slide. Now, I'm still on track, right? I know that you want to be out here at 1:30, so I'm going to talk real fast to get through all this. But I've still got 15 minutes, right? This is Iraq. The green part of Iraq is actually an elevation of 200 feet or less. But the reason I show this is because the green also represents the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the land between the rivers, Mesopotamia. It is so visible. You're flying in an aircraft, whether it's rotary wing or fixed wing, that you can see where the desert ends and Mesopotamia begins, and how they've expanded out Mesopotamia with canals into the desert. It's so obvious why for 5,000 years every empire has been trying to capture this land. And only in the last 100 years has oil been there, has oil become of importance. But before that, it's so different from Kuwait, where it's just pure sand. Next slide. This is a picture flying over southern Iraq, and you can see the wetlands, see how rich and fertile it is. And it was a hostile area. Next slide. This is another picture. This is near Tulum, which is a city in southern Iraq. You can see all the orchards there because there's canals. Next slide. You can also see the next slide, the orchards there. You can see the desert visibly right there. You can see the canals that feed up to the orchards. So it's fascinating to fly over the terrain and see what is there from the air. Next slide. This is when I first arrived in Iraq. I'm geared up. I'm over geared up because it's the first time in Iraq. I have more equipment I need to be wearing, but I'm in full body armor. I have my 9mm on my hip. It actually was a low-riding holster intentionally, a drop-down holster, so it didn't. I could get to it quickly because my body armor came to my waist. I'm in the Kevlar, obviously. Anytime you were flying in theater and it was a hot zone, you had to be geared up. Anytime you're arriving in theater, you're always geared up because when you're landing, that's always a dangerous time because you're more susceptible to being attacked. It's fascinating to land in theater in a combat zone because you're flying at maybe 10 or 12,000 feet and you start working your way down, and then suddenly the plane just does a tilt. It's like a roller coaster ride. And you do this really steep descent, and then as you get close, the pilots flare the aircraft, and maybe at 100, 200 feet, they do a flare, and then you land. So it is really a steep descent. And my wife, who doesn't like roller coasters, would never have liked landing in a combat zone. In the back there, you see all these bunkers. These bunkers were built by Saddam to protect his fighter aircraft. He got a guarantee from the French contractor that these bunkers would survive any attack by any of his enemies. Well, when the contractors built this, his enemies were primarily Iran and maybe Kuwait, and Kuwait wasn't that threatening. But when we attacked the Desert Storm back in 1991, our bunker busters just destroyed these things. And Saddam sued the French contractor, and the French contractor said, the U.S. wasn't your enemy back then. He lose, and he did lose it also. Next slide. At the beginning of the war in 2003, the command there, the military command was Multinational Forces Iraq. Of course, as you know, for political reasons, many of the countries that were our coalition partners dropped out of the coalition. When I was there, the new command, U.S. Forces Iraq. Next slide. U.S. Forces Iraq one. U.S. Forces Iraq was headquartered here at Al Fayed Palace. Al Fayed Palace was Saddam's summer palace. It was enormous. He had 60 palaces all throughout Iraq. Al Fayed Palace is surrounded by a man-made lake, and you see the causeway heading to it. Next slide. Off of this causeway, I took this photograph. It's hard for you to see because the picture's not big enough, obviously. But there's a mosque straight out in the distance. It's in the center there. That was Saddam's personal mosque, and he had his own personal imam. And that's important because the imam's palace, just next to this mosque, became the courtroom for U.S. Forces Iraq. You also see up at the top this little white spot. That's actually a blimp. That blimp was something we always liked because that blimp protected you right at the wall or at the wire, and it had 360-degree ability to look down. And if there's any incoming rounds, it could catch them. It couldn't catch them. It could spot where they're coming from. It could then have call return fire by going back to that spot, as well as can alert us that we're incoming rounds. So those blimps are good things. Next slide. This is the door to Al Fayed Palace. Down to the right is Staff Sergeant Marcus Brothers, who was my court reporter when I was in Iraq. You can see how small it is compared to the door. Next slide. You've probably seen this in Time or Newsweek. Both Presidents Bush and Obama have been there for re-enlistment ceremonies. This is the center of Al Fayed Palace, the main hall. Next slide. And this is a chair that Yasser Arafat gave to Saddam Hussein. And supposedly it was jinxed, but all of us said it, and anyway got our pictures taken. So sometimes you're working 24/7. You also get bored as a soldier, so you find entertaining things to do. And this is one of the things. Next slide. This is the imam's palace to the left I was telling you about that Saddam built for his imam. It's a pretty nice palace. It's not real big. It's surrounded by its own little lake. Off in the distance, you see a mosque with 2 minarets. That mosque is outside the wire. So that shows you how close we were to the wire. So if I was outside walking around, and I ran by the wall many times when I exercised, but I knew that I needed to be close to a bunker if I needed to get one. The courthouse, though, was hardened. It was made out of granite. Next slide. And you can see all the sandbags that we, American forces, had put up by the windows, because windows are not shatterproof unless you're specially made to be shatterproof. So we always had sandbags covering windows. Next slide. This was my window when I first arrived, and it was, you can see it was well protected. Next slide. And this was my wonderful quarters when I first arrived in Iraq. This is an 8x6 closet, but the nice thing was it was inside that Iman's palace. The first night I was in Iraq, I actually heard mortar rounds going off in the distance, and if I had not been in a hardened facility like a CHU, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute, CHU is a containerized housing unit with the troops were, I would have been running to a bunker. And I had to say, because I knew I was in a hardened place with sandbags to my left and granite to my on the top above me, that I just rolled over my bunk and went back to sleep. I should have done an accounting, but I knew I was in a safe place. So you have to realize that the soldiers were suffering a lot harder than the officers. So 8 feet by 6 feet was actually a good accommodation. Next slide. When I was there, first in Iraq, I was supposed to be at the 4th Circuit Judicial Conference at the Greenbrier, and I was limited to these incredible 20, 22, 23, 24-year-old soldiers where I was supposed to be instead of my 8 by 6 foot closet. They didn't have a clue what the Greenbrier was. But they downloaded the Greenbrier's trademark and decided to kind of cross off the green and put up JAG and cross out the park. It says America's Resort, but Iraq's Resort. So I came back from being on the bench and I saw this on my room, and I realized that they had a great sense of humor. And I do want to say this about those incredible young men and women. In our country, we have about 2.3 million men and women in uniform at any given time. That's total. That's everybody. Active, reserve, National Guard. That's all. In a country of about 320 million. So only 2/3 of 1% of this country, 2/3 of 1% of this country is defending this country from foreign and domestic enemies. That's one of the lowest, it is definitely the lowest percentage since World War II. It's one of the lowest percentages in the history of this country. So thank that 2.2 to 2.3 million that are in uniform. To compare that to another number, at any given time we have about 2.3 million Americans in prison or jail. So the number in uniform is equal to those incarcerated in the United States. Next slide. This is one of the CHU's containerized housing units I was talking about a few moments ago. These were actually wet CHUs that had bathrooms. And I got to use them when I was traveling, but most CHU's, containerized housing units that the troops lived in, did not have indoor plumbing at all. Next slide. This is the courtroom. Next slide. This is me sitting on the bench. Next slide. The most famous thing about that courtroom in Iman's palace was that Saddam Hussein was arraigned there. This is a picture of the arraignment. I was not there, obviously, for the arraignment. Next slide. In addition to serving as a military judge presiding over the 25 court martials in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan, I also did a lot of diplomacy and rule of law training, meeting with Iraqi and Afghan judges, and this is where I was meeting with judges from their Ministry of Interior. They had a judicial system in their Ministry of Interior. The Ministry of Interior is more like our Department of Justice. It's their law enforcement department. So these judges preside over public corruption cases. Next slide. Now, you couldn't travel around in Iraq or Afghanistan outside the wire without going in an armored vehicle. This was an MRAP. This is the main armored vehicle over there. MRAP stands for Mine Resistant Ambush Protected. And it has a V-hull, so if it travels over an IED, the explosion goes up on either side. And this is also, it's obviously fully armored, it also is weaponized. Not all MRAPs or armored vehicles had weapon systems on them. The ones I traveled usually did not have weapon systems, but they were armored vehicles. Next slide. This is another MRAP. Behind that is an up-armored Hummer. Up-armored Hummers were better than Hummers without any armor, but they were nothing compared to MRAP. Next slide. This is me in an armored vehicle without weapon systems, so it's definitely an armored vehicle. Next slide. Now we're driving through downtown Baghdad. This is just an example of the battle, the torment that Baghdad has had. You see that building with most of the windows going out. Next slide. And that's because of 30 years of war. It's not just us, it's the Iranians. This country's been in war for a long time. By the time I was there, the Iraqi army had taken up security in Baghdad, so this is just a Hummer that's doing security checks. Next slide. This is the famous Tigris River. It goes right through Baghdad. Next slide. This is soldiers playing again. This is inside the green zone. Would have never done this outside the green zone. This is Major Joshua Toman, who I mentioned a moment ago. He was basically the chief prosecutor for U.S. forces in Iraq. And we're at the famous parade grounds of Saddam Hussein in the green zone or international zone. Next slide. And that's what he was doing. Which I'm doing there. So once again, we're being tourists, but we didn't have to worry about any kind of grounds there. We're in the green zone. We're pretty safe. Next slide. This is in the Ba'athist Party headquarters. This is where Saddam Hussein was actually tried. The Iraqi government thought it appropriate that he should be tried in the headquarters of the party that he kind of, that he ran and he used as his force to keep control of the political structure. Next slide. This is me pretending now the chief judge of the Iraqi Special Tribunal, which was the Iraqi court that actually prosecuted him or adjudicated his case. Next slide. And these two palaces were the palaces of Uday and Kuzay, his two sons. We bombed them, and you can see the damage on them during the initial invasion. Even though they were severely damaged, we hid Saddam in there during his trial. Because one was inside the wire, was right by Al-Fal Palace. This is only about a half mile from where I slept in the Imam's Palace. And we didn't think anyone would figure out. Everyone thought these buildings were destroyed. But we were able to build cells in there and keep them in there. And he was actually in the palace to the left. Next slide. This is amusing. This was the Victory Over America Palace that Saddam was building in 2003 when we invaded. He really was building, it was a little premature. He was building this palace in 2003 based on his claim that he had won in 1991. And of course, when I was there in 2011, nothing had happened for 8 years since our invasion. It was just like that. Next slide. Now, towards the end of the war, and the drawdown in Iraq, everything moved south to Cobb Adder. Cobb stands for Contingency Operating Base Adder. Everything was shut down north of there, and even in Cobb Adder, the only thing left was a few headquarters facilities. But we had to maintain good order and discipline, which meant we had to have the ability to preside, have a court-martial if soldiers did things wrong. Because if they did things wrong and there was no punishment, then of course, particularly during a drawdown, you'd have some real serious chaos. Next slide. So we did have the last court-martial in Iraq in this facility, a plywood building. It was one of the few buildings that had a telecommunication link because half the witnesses were always coming to testifying from the United States by video conference or teleconference. We were eating MREs. There was no dining facility. This was combat condition court-martial. Next slide.